Voices of Titanic podcast, episode 9, and I'm your host, Sam. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's episode is very sad, but it's also quite unusual in that while the individual technically survived the night of April 15th, the experience of the sinking may have led to her death a couple of years later. I randomly saw a comment online somewhere about who inspired the scene in James Cameron's Titanic. It's the scene when Thomas Andrews tells the stewardess to put on a life belt and to set a good example. I saw the woman's name and ended up researching her story and was really shocked by what I found. It is a puzzling mystery, to say the least. This is the story of Annie Robinson. Annie Robinson was born Elizabeth Annie Franklin on February 27, 1865 in Bedford, England. A little bit about Bedford. Bedford is a historic county town in Bedfordshire. It's a riverside town located in the central UK, surrounded by the countryside and not far from London, Oxford, and Cambridge. The town dates back to 886 and was once an important market town for local agriculture. Industries such as wool in the Middle Ages and lace during the 1500s were also important to the area. These markets brought success to the area up until the 20th century. Engineering and brewing were also pivotal to Bedford's economy, and one of the major brewers, Charles Wells, is still existing today. Currently, the town boasts a population of nearly 153,000 and is a booming town full of cultural diversity. Back to Annie. Annie was born to dad Charles Simeon Franklin and mother Elizabeth Ann Franklin. As of 1871, Annie had two younger sisters, Mary Albina and Sarah Emma. 10 years later, at 16 years of age, Annie was living with her family at 10 Maitland Street. They still lived in Bedfordshire, but she now had a little brother, Charles, who was 10 years her junior. Her father worked as a smith in a foundry, while Annie and her sister Mary both worked as domestic servants. On August 29, 1885, Annie married Tom Snell Grierson Curswell in the Liverpool Parish Church. He was a Liverpool native and he worked as an accountant. 6 years later, the couple lived in Liskeard, Cheshire, England, and had a 4-year-old daughter born July 16, 1886. Passing along the tradition from her own mother, her daughter's name was also Annie. The 1891 census shows Annie Robinson's sister Mary was also living with them at the time, and that Annie's husband Tom was working as a, quote, ship's husband. I had to kind of do a double take when I was looking at the census because I'd never seen this term before, and I thought maybe there was a mistake, and it was an actual term, and it meant that it was an agent who would represent a ship owner's interests on land, and they would attend to its provisions, its repair, and its management. In 1893, Annie and Tom had another daughter, Dorothy Albine. She was born in Lancashire, England, and was baptized on August 30th, 1895. Now, I hate to say this, but I researched, and I could not find any documentation to fill in the gaps of Annie's life from 1895 to 1906, so I do apologize. There's a lot of information on Encyclopedia Titanica about her and her family story that you can totally check out if you'd like. It's a really great site. I love it. It's just that I prefer to tell stories from the evidence that I can find so I can support it with facts that I can see with my own eyes. Sadly, not even Encyclopedia Titanica knows why Annie took the last name Robinson. Would love to hear any theories you might have. I could not find any relatives with the name Robinson, no last names, no middle names or anything. So I'm not sure if it's something that she possibly used for jobs. Would love to know if anyone has an idea. We might never know. So we fast forward to 1906. Annie Robinson was a stewardess on a ship called the Lake Champlain. She signed on to work in Liverpool, England on May 4th, 1906 for £3 a month. She gave her address as 3 West Bank Avenue in New Brighton. The SS Lake Champlain was a steel steamer built in 1900 by the Barclay Curle and Company. It started out having a passenger capacity of 680, and then after a change in ownership in 1906, the capacity increased to 1,300. Now, I find this really interesting, but on May 21st, 1901, the Lake Champlain was the first British merchant ship to equip a permanent wireless telegraphy system supplied by the one and only Marconi Company, the same company that equipped the Titanic's wireless system. We obviously know the Titanic's fate, so I found it very bizarre that Annie Robinson was also on board the SS Lake Champlain when it struck an iceberg in 1909. I mean, what are the odds you are on two different ships that collide with an iceberg? Fortunately for Annie and the other passengers, the ship did not sink. It only endured structural damage, and it did make it to its intended destination. Annie later signed on to the Titanic on April 6, 1912 as a stewardess. Her former ship is listed as the SS Lake Manitoba. It was used for the same Beaver Line service as the SS Lake Champlain. Her address was listed as 128 Shirley Road, and her assigned wages were £3, 10 shillings a month. There's little information on her experience during the voyage, but we do have her testimony from the British Commissioner's Inquiry to fill us in on the night of the sinking. I'm going to read you some of the transcript here for you now so you can hear what happened in Annie's words. She was questioned by a Mr. Raymond Asquith. Raymond asks, "You were a first-class stewardess on the Titanic, were you not?" Annie says, "Yes. And at the time the ship struck the iceberg, I think you were in bed?" "I was." "Did you get up and dress?" "I did." "And did you afterwards go in the direction of the mailroom?" "Yes." "What deck were you on?" "E deck." "When you got to the top of the stairs, which led down to the mailroom, what did you see?" Annie said, "I saw 2 mailbags and a man's Gladstone bag, and on looking down the staircase, I saw water within 6 steps of coming onto E deck." He asked, "Well, that would mean that it had gone up to the top of the mailroom and into the compartment above that." She answered, "Certainly." "Are the stairs you are speaking of the ones by the side of the squash rackets court?" She says, "Yes." Now there's some discussion between Asquith, the commissioner, and the Solicitor General about the location of the mailroom, and then we get back to the questioning. The commissioner asks Annie, "About what time was this?" She answers, "About half an hour after she struck." "After the collision?" She answered, "After the collision, about half an hour." Mr. Asquith asks, "Did you see the captain and Mr. Andrews about this time?" Annie said, "The mailman passed along first, and he returned with Mr. McElroy and the captain, and they went in the direction of the mailroom, but that was before." They asked, "It was seeing the captain and Mr. Andrews going to the mailroom that made you go there?" She said, "I followed after they had come back." The commissioner, "Are we to understand that at this time the mailroom was covered with water?" Mr. Asquith responded, "Yes, and not only the mailroom, but the story immediately above it, too." Then he redirects his attention back to Annie and asks her, "When you saw the water there, I suppose you realized that things were rather serious." "I did." "Did you go and look after your ladies?" "I did." "How many ladies were under your charge?" 7 ladies and 1 maid and a governess." "Did you see other stewardesses doing the same thing, looking after their passengers?" "The stewardess on my deck was doing exactly the same thing." "Did you then go upstairs onto A deck?" "I had to call a stewardess I had met on the boat on A deck." "Were you told by a steward there to put on your coat and life belt?" "Mr. Andrews told me first." "Did Mr. Andrews tell you anything else?" "Yes, Mr. Andrews told me to put my life belt on after I'd been on E deck." "Did he say something to you about blankets?" "We had already got the blankets and the life belts out of the rooms which were unoccupied at the foot of the staircase. Mr. Andrews said to me, 'Put your life belt on and walk about and let the passengers see you.' I said to him, 'It looks rather mean,' and he said, 'No, put it on,' and then after that he said to me, 'Well, if you value your life, put your belt on.'" She was then asked, "Did you put your belt on and walk about in it?" "I did." "Did he say anything to you about Mr. Ismay?" "No, Mr. Ismay's name was never mentioned in my hearing." "So far as you know, were all the ladies on E deck warned by the stewardesses whose business it was to look after them?" "Yes," she replied, "and they were all saved too." "You told us you were responsible for 7 or 8 ladies. Were they all saved?" "They were." "Eventually you were put into boat number 11? "Yes." There are some questions about a carpenter on her lifeboat and if she spoke to him. I'm still unsure of who this man was and why they were inquiring about him. And then Asquith continues with, "When your boat left the ship, was the band still playing?" Annie said, "It was." "Can you remember at all what time it was when your boat left?" "Well, I looked at my watch when the ship went down, and it was 20 minutes to 2. That was by altered time when we were in the boat, and I do not think we were in the boat more than 3/4 of an hour." Asquith, you left about 3/4 of an hour before the ship went down? Yes. Now when Mr. Scanlon begins to question her. Can you state at what time it was when Mr. Andrews said to you, if you value your life, put your lifebelt on? She responded, it was about half an hour when I saw the water on the deck, and I should say it would be about 1/4 of an hour after that. About 3/4 of an hour after the collision, you mean? Yes. Now there are questions by a Mr. Cotter. He asked her, have you ever been in a collision before? Annie says, yes. What ship was that? The Lake Champlain? Yes. Also an iceberg? Yes. So that you knew exactly what to do on this occasion? Yes. And you did it? Yes. Now Sir Robert Finley comes in with questions. He asked, when was it you were told to put on the lifebelt? You said that it was 3/4 of an hour after something? She answered, I said it was 3/4 of an hour after I felt the shock of the collision. Did the people get into the boat in an orderly way? Yes. Did you hear the band playing? Yes. Was it still playing when you left the ship? Yes, it was. It was playing when I went up to A deck to call the other stewardess, and when I left the ship, it was still playing. And then the witness withdrew. I think this testimony is pretty incredible. Annie Robinson was able to give clear and concise details about the timeline of the sinking, as well as where she saw the water rising. And to be one of the last people to speak to Mr. Andrews before his death is pretty amazing. To also be one of the last people to see Captain Smith alive, too. It's really remarkable she was able to retain these details after experiencing a traumatic event, but also to remember them clearly after a month had gone by. On April 20th, 1912, 172 of the surviving crew members departed from New York for England on the ship Lapland. Among this crew were the surviving 20 stewardesses, including Annie Robinson. Heartbreakingly, the Lapland was also carrying nearly 2,000 sacks of U.S. mail. This was intended for the Titanic's return voyage back to Southampton. Lapland arrived in Plymouth on April 28th. The survivors were greeted with cheers, emotional relatives, and very curious reporters. Over a year later, as reported by the Evening Dispatch on Saturday, July 12, 1913, Annie met King George V and Queen Consort Queen Mary on board the Mauritania's tender Galatea. Here is an excerpt from the paper. Aboard the Mauritania. The spectacle at the river pageant which followed was the most imposing and picturesque that the Mersey had ever witnessed. Gaily beflagged and stretching up and down the river for 10 miles were some of the finest specimens of Britain's mercantile marine. There were also 2 cruisers, the Lancaster and the Liverpool. Their Majesties made the journey on board the Galatea, the dockboard tender. On the boat was Mrs. Robinson, who was stewardess on the Titanic when the liner went down. The King and Queen had quite a long conversation with Mrs. Robinson about her experience on that fateful night. Quote, I was in the last but 2 of the boats to leave the ship, the lady said. Well, said His Majesty, I congratulate you upon being saved. Do you really think it would have been possible to have saved more of the passengers? Yes, answered Mrs. Robinson. I think more of the third-class passengers might have been got off. The reason more were not saved, in my opinion, was that they paid more attention to getting their belongings than saving their lives. It was a dreadful thing, and your Majesty will not be surprised to know it pains me even to think of it. I do not wonder at that, sympathetically remarked His Majesty. On the journey, the tender came alongside the great Cunard or Mauritania, and their Majesties went nearly all over the ship. What an insane journey to have been on 2 ships that crashed into icebergs and then to be having this long conversation with the King and Queen at the time. And here is where her story takes a dark turn and she meets tragedy once again. On October 1st, 1914, Annie boarded the SS Devonian, a Leyland Line ocean liner, also built at Harland and Wolff. She was documented as being a housekeeper and a widow. She embarked in Liverpool, with her arrival being in Boston, and her final destination was Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. The intent of her visit was to see her daughter, formerly known as Annie, but now going by the name Gladys. She was now living in Massachusetts with her husband, James Prentice. Annie Robinson was last seen on the night of October 9th at around 10:30 p.m. in the main saloon of the ship. The SS Devonian was forced to slow down in heavy fog with its whistle blowing constantly. Annie was reported missing the next morning when she didn't make an appearance at breakfast. Passengers and crew believed that she jumped overboard in the night. Officers of the ship said that she had been, quote, in a state of great nervous excitement because of the fog and the sounding of the foghorn. The Honolulu Star Bulletin claimed she had been suffering from, quote, nervous trouble since her rescue from the Titanic. They also go on to say that the fog the Devonian experienced, quote, brought on a fit of depression which caused her to become deranged, end quote. Annie Robinson was 47 years old. I could not locate any documentation that her body was found, but she was presumed to have drowned. Now, I have a few things to say about this that I find upsetting. First of all, her death was reduced to a tiny blurb in multiple newspapers across the United States, all repeating the same thing. It was like they were copied and pasted across multiple channels, and it was really disheartening. It's also shocking to me that people presume to know her mental state. It doesn't indicate anywhere that there were witnesses to her death. It was just that she was last seen that night in the saloon. I personally think it's really damaging and dangerous to someone's name and to their family to assume to know someone's emotional status at the time of their death, and if their emotional state at the time contributed to their death is a big claim. Annie could not defend herself. I also feel like there was a lack of empathy in reporting her death. It was very factual and straight to the point, and I understand that these were different times, but it really broke my heart for her daughter. So one can break this down in different ways because there are a few possibilities here. It is possible she fell overboard accidentally. That's not completely out of the question. The foghorn was blasting and the fog was really dense. If Annie were in fact having a post-traumatic episode, it's entirely within reason that she could have fallen to her death in panic. Or it's within the realm of possibility that her mental state was calm and she accidentally fell to her death. Annie had already experienced a ship hitting an iceberg prior to the Titanic disaster, and she told the British Commissioner's inquiry that she knew exactly what to do in an emergency and followed orders for that specific scenario. So she was able to take care of her charges, and she remembered key details of that night in spectacular detail. That doesn't mean she wasn't traumatized by her experience. You can be calm in the face of danger and still be haunted by what you endured, absolutely. I just hate to assume her psychological state of mind, especially when you see things in the papers like she was, quote, deranged. We also have other possibilities that in a state of panic, having her fight or flight response activated, Annie Robinson did intentionally jump. I know when I've been triggered by past traumas, my first inclination is to escape and get away as fast as possible from whatever has stirred things up inside of me. Many papers referred to her death as a suicide. It's plausible she did take her own life, sure. She had experienced 2 traumatic events on ships and the death of her husband. Maybe she thought she was in danger again, and the thought of enduring something like that again was just too much for her. I don't know, and none of us will ever know for certain, but I have a hard time believing she intentionally killed herself while taking a transatlantic crossing to go visit her daughter. It seems highly unusual. It's a fairly long trip, and she knows that there are risks involved, so she's taking it. She has the intent to see her family. It just doesn't really add up for me. But when we see all these scenarios laid out, it makes me want to approach the story with more empathy than we saw in the papers. 1914 was a very different time. They didn't have all these terms like PTSD, flashbacks, triggers, episodes, etc. So I want to try and dig a little deeper for her sake. One common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder is hypervigilance. This is when a person is in a state of high alert. They are constantly on guard. They are tense 24/7. The individual will be on the lookout for impending danger, whether it's real or just presumed danger, doesn't matter. This is why people with this disorder can react strongly to loud and unexpected noises, smells, visual cues. If this was something Annie was struggling with, her brain could have been responding to the possibility of another catastrophic disaster. It could also be the case that Annie was experiencing a flashback induced by the fog and the blaring foghorn. Flashbacks can be very vivid and real, feeling like they are happening again in the present time. This comes with symptoms such as fear, anxiety, anger, racing heart, a struggle to breathe, and the sensation of detaching from one's body. Individuals struggling with PTSD can experience flashbacks as visual images, seeing the event play out in their mind, but it can also come up as sounds, smells, or other sensations that may be associated with the traumatic event. What I find really scary is that flashbacks can be so vivid for some that it's sometimes difficult for them to differentiate between a flashback and reality. Maybe Annie was experiencing a flashback and fell off the Devonian accidentally in a state of terror and panic. Maybe she was reliving the night of April 15th, 1912. Whatever the case, Annie died tragically. She served her passengers well that night on the ship, and she gave testimony that was extremely helpful to our record of the sinking. She was a mother and later a grandmother and a great-grandmother after her death. Whatever happened to her, I hope she was able to find peace in the end. As we give voice to Titanic victims and survivors, I like to pay tribute to their legacies as well. So let's talk about her daughters, Dorothy Albine and Gladys Prentice, aka Annie Kurswell. There's far more information on Gladys than Dorothy. I'm not sure why. Dorothy grew up to be a school teacher and worked at Aspen Grove School in Liverpool. I do not believe she ever married or had children, but she did live a long life, and she died at the age of 87 in 1981. I really wish there was more I could tell you about her, but the information was just so limited. Now, Gladys, on the other hand, she married James E. Prentice from Africa on November 17, 1908 in Boston, Massachusetts at the age of 23. 2 years later, they were settled down in Worcester, Massachusetts, sharing a home with what looks like maybe one of James's family members. James worked as a clerk at a ticket office while Gladys took care of the home. In 1915, Gladys and James had their first son, Thomas, and 2 years later, in 1917, they had their second boy, named after his father, James. Tragically, Gladys passed away in 1929 at only 43 years old in Boston. I could not locate any cause of death. I also find it really sad that she died in her 40s, just like her mother did. She was survived by her husband and 3 sons, Thomas, who was now 15, James was 13, and there was a new boy, a baby 1-year-old Charles. It's really devastating that she died shortly after having a baby. It's so heartbreaking. James Prentice eventually remarried and passed away in 1947 in Boston. Their son, Theodore Prentice, was a laborer for a railroad company. He married a girl named Louisa in 1935, and he had 3 children, Nancy, born in 1934, Gladys, named after his mother, born in 1937, and Thomas T. Prentice Jr., born in 1939. In 1943, they had another son, Charles. Thomas Sr.'s last recorded job was as a station attendant for a retail gasoline station. He died in 1993 at 78 years old. Gladys's other child, James Jr., graduated from the Boston High School of Commerce and graduated from Rutland Business School. He later studied for Christ the King Diocese in the New England area of the Anglican Church for 3 years. In 1958, he started a job as an office manager and worked there for 20 years before becoming ordained for the Sacred Order of Permanent Deacons in the Anglican Church in 1985. He was appointed as a deacon and served for 10 years until his declining health forced him to retire. He died on November 28, 2000 in Nashua, New Hampshire at the age of 84. He never married or had children. Gladys and James' youngest son, Charles, married Jacqueline Marie Donnell on November 29, 1952, when he was 23. They married in Seabrook, Massachusetts. He was a sergeant in the Marines and served in the Korean War. His registration card described him as 143 pounds, 5 feet 11 inches. He had a tattoo on his left arm, and he had brown hair and blue eyes. He died at 68 years old on New Year's Eve, 1997. I am unsure if he and Jacqueline had had any children. Annie Robinson's life and death will sadly forever remain a mystery. I wish we had more answers to what happened to her on that foggy night. Her family deserved answers. whatever happened to her on the Devonian, I think we can confidently say that she died too soon and she should have had more written about her in the papers. She followed her duties as a stewardess during 2 maritime accidents. She took care of her charges. She remained calm and collected, all while remembering vital details about the sinking of the Titanic that helped many people put together a timeline of what happened in 1912. She had a family, and that family carried on for generations, many of them dedicating their lives to service like she did, which I find very beautiful, whether this was in the church, in education, or in the military. I really hope that Annie was not suffering at the time of her death. May she rest in peace. Let's pause and pay our respects to Annie for her contributions to the passengers on the night of April 14th, 1912, in her service, not just on ships, but in life as well, to her children. Let's also have a moment of silence for her death and all those who have been lost at sea. Thank you, crew, for joining me in today's episode. As we disembark, I wish you happiness, love, and peace. Take care, and I'll see you next time on the Voices of Titanic.